Hi everyone, my name is Valerie and I'm a licensed mental health counselor here at First Light Psychological Services. And I want to thank you for joining me in this webinar where I'll be discussing digital dependence specific to video games. So my goal for this webinar is to help people understand if video games are helping you to enhance your life or escape your life. And that's going to be based upon a whole bunch of different factors. I'm going to start off with some brief summaries about the different types of games, and then I'll get more into the psychology about the positives and negatives. So I will begin where it all began, arcade games. These coin-eating machines are filled with short, simple levels that get more difficult as you progress through them. Sometimes there's an end goal, but other times the fun is just to see what the highest score is that you can get. Arcade games may be the oldest type of game now, but they are still extremely popular at places like Dave & Buster's, for example. It's kind of like a casino for kids. The first arcade video game was Pong, the two-dimensional digital table tennis. Other classic arcade video games that you may have heard of are Pac-Man, Space Invaders, and Pinball. Nowadays, these games aren't played because they have good graphics. They're played because they're nostalgic, which is a feeling just as enjoyable as the actual game. The most commonly played genre is action. Action games focus a lot on challenges. The player takes the form of a persona, or a main character in a storyline, which has them battling enemies, overcoming obstacles, navigating and exploring different levels wherever the game takes place, be it a hidden planet or a football field. You use different types of weapons and tools, collecting and trading, and so much more. The goal of this genre is typically to complete various levels and defeat a final bigger enemy without losing all of your lives first. The player is literally going through a sequence of events, completing small goals along the way in order to complete the biggest goal and object of the game. The second most common genre is shooter games, which really is a subcategory of action games. The player is doing many of the same objectives that an action game has, except the primary weapons of choice involve guns. The focus is to complete levels or missions without dying so that you can complete goals that surround defeating the enemy. You may have heard the terms first-person shooter and third-person shooter. These are terms that are used to describe how the player's character is displayed. First person being that you are viewing things from the character's point of view and shooting your weapons as if you're really holding them. And third person being that you are able to see your character whose primary weapon is, again, a gun. The next most popular type is sports video games, which is pretty self-explanatory. The player is literally just playing a sport, and it can get just as competitive as the real deal. Nowadays, these video games are designed to appear just like real sports teams, with the same play styles and strategizing, all within a stadium or arena. Sports games are actually one of the earlier genres of video games. To give you some perspective, I previously mentioned the arcade game Pong. Well, that's actually also considered a sports video game, so we've come a long way with technology. The next popular one is role-playing games, also known as RPGs, and they're extremely popular because of how in-depth the plot and character dynamics are. These games center on storylines where the player is in control of a main character or a group of characters, which is often referred to as a party. The cool thing about RPGs that makes them so enticing is that your character can interact with other characters and creatures, and these interactions actually dictate the direction that the story takes. For example, if you are in a game and you approach another character, it will show a cutscene with scripts, almost like you're watching a movie. The player will then be presented with what is known as a dialogue tree or dialogue wheel, where they can choose how they would like to respond. So let's say you have this random character that asks you for a favor, and you have your character respond to agree to help them. This character will now look at you favorably and maybe be an ally of some sort, and this could be beneficial for your gameplay. On the other hand, let's say you have the option to tell this character to get lost and you don't want to help them. Well, odds are this character won't respond well, and what if you end up needing them later in the game? This is why people will repeatedly play these games, because you can play the same video game over and over again, but the story can be drastically different depending on the choices you make. RPGs also have very advanced maps within the game because they take place in their own worlds. So exploration is really fun and exciting. For example, if you think about Star Wars video games, you're able to travel to all the different planets and just free roam, which is really awesome, especially nowadays because the graphics are so realistic that you really feel like you're there. Also, during exploration, you can find items to upgrade your character as the story progresses, which is usually an essential part of the story and character growth, such as gaining new powers or abilities that impact the game. So, I would say most RPGs are also classified as adventure games. Adventure games are their own genre, but there's often overlap here. With adventure games, the player is progressing through an interactive story, but they lack the same character interaction and growth that RPGs have, which is why they are classified as separate genres. You're following a story that is more set in stone, but they can be just as emotional. Another type of game is fighting games. So, fighting video games center around close combat between characters, typically 2 or more. Usually the goal of fighting games is to defeat your opponents until you're the last person or the last team standing. Characters usually have different abilities too, and players work on learning the different ways they can attack and block. These games are also cool because characters usually have their own special attack that they get to use after doing different fighting combinations. So if you've ever heard of the term button mashing, it seems to have originated from combat games like these. Because people are, you're hitting all the buttons trying to get all these combinations. And then again, you get that really cool special effect, if you complete them all in the right way. And another thing you can also see in these games is a timer. And that usually just adds to the challenge. You have to try to beat your opponent before the clock runs out. So racing is another genre which involves player competition to win a race that can be done through different methods of transportation. You might see go-karts, motorcycles, or sports cars on a racetrack, spaceships in, space, or maybe on some planet. You could be traveling by plane, hoverboards, or even racing on foot. It all depends on the game. In addition to just the players competing for first place, sometimes there are other obstacles to look out for. Some games are set in locations that have their own challenges. For example, depending on setting, you may or may not have an advantage or disadvantage. Certain vehicles might not do as well on certain terrain, such as a sports car on a rocky, sandy road versus a dirt bike that can handle all the bumps and hills and whatnot. Some games also have objects that can be used during races to help you and or hurt an opponent. Mario Kart is a perfect example of this. While you're driving, you have the opportunity to pick up power-ups like the famous turtle shells and bananas that you can throw at opponents to make their vehicle temporarily stop so that it gives you an advantage to get ahead. There are also the mushrooms that give you that temporary speed boost, or the stars that make you temporarily immune to any attacks. So these are just random examples that really demonstrate objects that you can use to your advantage in the game. It's pretty cool. So strategy video games are another type of game, and they are all about thinking and planning in order to complete an objective. They're otherwise known as thinking games because you have to carefully focus and apply logic to outsmart your opponent. Players are typically working independently to gather information, process that information in a timely manner, and then make decisions for the best possible outcome, ultimately to achieve victory. It plays a lot into character strengths and weaknesses, as well as resources available to your character. Now, like strategy games, puzzle games are another genre that is all about problem solving. Different skills can be tested depending on the type of puzzle, which can involve matching items, finding hidden objects, identifying and solving patterns and sequences with numbers or words, or the game could literally just be a traditional puzzle. Actually, now that I'm thinking on this, I totally have the Jigsaw puzzle application on my phone, and that is technically considered a puzzle video game. So another type of game are simulation video games, and these are realistic games. I know that probably sounds a little odd and vague because nowadays a lot of games are meant to look realistic, especially with all the technology advancements, but there is a reason this is its own genre. Simulations are meant to be nearly, if not completely, exact to real-world functions. An example would be the game called Flight Simulator. It's exactly as it says. You are flying airplanes the way a pilot would in real life. The controls are specific to each aircraft model, and even things like the weather can impact your flight. So even the weather is considered a simulation. These games also frequently involve other genres, which makes sense because you're simulating whatever it is. An example of this overlap would be simulation sports. Remember when the Wii came out years ago? The Wii was essentially a simulation console because it allowed people to carry out real-world tasks, but you had to physically move to do so. Look at, Wii bowling or Wii tennis. Now, think about The Sims. The whole game involves you making a character to look however you want, to live a life the way you want it, and Sims can pick out their clothes for different occasions. They can design their own homes. They can have their own pets, friendships, relationships, marriages, children. They can learn and develop skills like cooking, singing, making music. They can have a career. They can even have their own social media. I mean, there's just so much. This is a life simulation. And just like in the real world, if you don't take care of your physical and mental health, you start to have problems. If you don't clean, the place gets dirty. If you don't go to work, you don't get paid and can lose your job. If you don't walk the dog, well, you get the idea. It's classified as simulation because it mimics real-world behavior, but taking care of yourself and advancing your skills is very strategic, and the socializing aspect of The Sims is role-playing as well because you play your character any way you wish to, and the results of each interaction will impact the direction of the game. So The Sims is actually a really great example of genre overlap. There are other genres, a lot actually, but these are the most common. Many fall into subgenres, which is usually because it can be either categorized further or there's just a common combination of genres that developed into some type of subgroup. As odd as this might sound, every single one of those categories that I just discussed can actually be productive and beneficial in a lot of ways. You may be questioning how some of these categories can be beneficial, so allow me to break it down. Benefits can include enhancements to cognition, motivation, emotions, and socialization. Cognitive skills can be enhanced most notably in action, shooting, strategic, and role-playing games. They can improve analytical and problem-solving skills, whether you're playing independently or with others. This helps build healthy decision-making. Video games can also improve memory. Mental rotation and visual processing can improve as well because players have to focus on more details, so they're becoming more aware of their surroundings and making sense of objects in their environment. As a result, they can find and use resources more effectively as well. Motivation can be enhanced in video games as well, most notably in strategic games and simulation games because it is all about learning and enhancing one's abilities, which improves a person's overall intelligence. They're really helpful with training people to use real-world skills. Also, when a person fails at a strategic game, for example, this actually creates motivation to try again. Failure becomes a motivator, which is healthy because it's building resilience and psychological flexibility. Emotional benefits include an enhancement to positive feelings and emotions, which can help with mood management and self-esteem. This is because the player is committing to the game and striving to achieve. It's a great feeling to achieve something, especially when it's challenging. Some genres help to promote relaxation by dealing with stress and frustration in adaptive ways, like puzzle games. Also, a bunch of these genres actually can boost inspiration. You could feel more connected with oneself or with others, which can build social relationships. Which leads me into the next part, which would be social benefits, which occur the most, I would say, with cooperative games across all genres or pro-social games like RPGs. Video games can promote the learning of social skills, supportive behavior, leadership, and organization and balance within a group. So really, there can be both a short or long-term desire to connect and help others. This can also assist with building empathy. As such, it can reduce aggressive communication and feelings of hostility and anger. And oddly enough, just as a side note, there can be medical benefits as well, because video games can be used to enhance motor skills and coordination, which is especially helpful for people recovering from injuries. So I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to add that in there. Now, again, remember that a lot of games have overlapping genres, so there can be enhancements to all of these areas within a single video game. Now, for the negatives. In general, it can be extremely time-consuming. It doesn't really promote physical activity. It can decrease a person's social life, and it can decrease proactivity. Also, what's really harmful is that it can give a false expectation of real life, sometimes so much that people believe that their true life is within the video game world. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, otherwise known as the DSM-5, internet gaming disorder is listed, but not yet an official diagnosis because it is still being researched. It's geared more toward internet use, since a lot of video games are now internet-based and more likely to cause significant disruptions to a person's life. Since the gaming community is still rapidly changing, it's important that it is studied extensively before a final set of criteria is released to warrant a clinical diagnosis. So as of right now, the proposed criteria would include 5 or more of the following symptoms: having an obsession or preoccupation with gaming. When gaming is taken away or not possible, withdrawal symptoms are experienced, such as increased irritability, anxiety, sadness, anger, etc. Tolerance increases, which means that more time needs to be spent playing games. There's also unsuccessful attempts to quit gaming or even just decrease use. Gaming has resulted in maybe a loss of interest in other activities and hobbies that were once previously enjoyed. Lying to others about the amount of time and money spent on gaming is another big factor. Using gaming as a means of escaping any negative feelings or emotions. Risking or losing a job or a relationship due to gaming. And continuing to game despite having awareness of any or all of these problems. Even if you don't meet all the criteria for a video game addiction, it doesn't mean that there's no negative impacts. And even if you are finding a lot of benefits to gaming, you still need to be mindful of the negatives as well, because sometimes they do outweigh the positives. So, how do you know if the gaming is helpful or harmful? Well, when you question if something you are doing is healthy, you have to think about why it would be unhealthy. First, it's important to note that health is defined as a state of physical, mental, and social well-being. Achieving and maintaining good health is what leads to a fulfilling life. So, when you look into what are the different aspects of life, you will get every number on Google. There's 3, there's 4, there's 5, 7, 9, 10, 15, 20. I mean, it's a lot. And it really makes things too confusing. Some of these aspects do take high priority, and I will explain which ones and why. But seriously, what really matters is what you define in your life as important. You just need to make sure you're really looking at yourself and being honest with yourself to identify and understand what areas are in need of improvement. So keep that in the forefront of your mind right now. There are a ton of aspects in one's life, but you need to start by assessing the aspects to being. Human life is made up of 4 aspects of the self: your mind, your body, your emotions, and your spirit. And when I say spirit, psychologically, I am referring to your sense of purpose and core values and beliefs. When all 4 of these are balanced, that is truly the definition of resilience. It does not mean each area is doing wonderfully all at the same time. It just means that you know how to handle the fluctuations of life in a healthy way. So again, this is known as your psychological flexibility. Just remember, there's a big difference between an area that is lacking and an area that is being neglected. So now take these 4 internal aspects of yourself and apply them to the other aspects specific to your life. First, assess your health in those 4 domains, the mental health, physical health, emotional health, and spiritual health. Because even if one of them is being neglected, it can drastically influence everything else in your life. Second, consider the other common areas of health that can be impacted. Think about how you are doing sexually, socially, intellectually, financially, occupationally, educationally, recreationally, environmentally, behaviorally, culturally, developmentally. I mean, the list really goes on, as you can see. It's a lot. I mean, you have to really think about all the different things going on in your life. And this list is black and white, though, because just like video game genres, there's overlap. Again, think about the aspects that are specific to just your life and how they impact you mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And remember, your spiritual health determines what is the most important to you deep down. So, what's going on in your life right now? How are you feeling? How's your job or school? What are your relationships like? Have you had any recent losses? Do you have any mental health conditions? Any unresolved trauma? What about substance abuse? Whatever the problem is, it may have led to coping with video games. Some people use video games as a way to detach from reality, which is okay if done temporarily just to de-stress. People need to take a break every now and again, and that's normal. However, if this is done in excess, you're trying to escape your life for some reason. Games have transformed so much, and they have become hyper-realistic, so it is easy to get lost in these other worlds. For example, if you have ever played The Sims, you know what I mean. Because really, with any game that includes character creation, you can create a character that looks identical to you, making it easier to pretend to be in an alternate reality. If someone has low self-esteem, though, they may be more likely to make characters that they wish they looked like. Being able to make a detailed character to play isn't a bad thing, it's just the mental health factor that is the core issue here. Now, have you ever gotten stuck on a level that you just couldn't beat, and you tried dozens of times to figure out a way, and then you're overjoyed when you realize the best way, and then you get that adrenaline boost, and before you know it, you can taste victory, and now the game glitched. And guess what? You lost again. Game over. It's so frustrating. It really is. There's no doubt about that. But how do you handle that frustration? Do you take a break from the game to cool off now and revisit it later? Remind yourself it's just a game and take some deep breaths. Or do you end by yelling or throwing your controller at the TV? If the latter is the case, you've got a low frustration tolerance and need to work on emotion regulation. Remember, a game can get frustrating, but overall, it's meant to be enjoyable. Another example, and this is one of those really debatable topics, is whether shooting games incite violence and mass shootings. Some say it does because it desensitizes the person and increases impulsivity or aggressive and violent thoughts. But some also say it doesn't because it serves as an outlet for that anger instead of directing it toward the actual triggers like other people. Some even continue to fantasize about this outside of gameplay. That is a red flag. But most importantly, you need to determine the level of self-control that you need in order to manage those thoughts and in-game actions to prevent real-life action. This is especially true for those who act out on emotion before thinking. If you have trouble figuring out what thoughts you're even having, an initial goal should be to build awareness of your inner dialogue, which can be done with the practice of mindfulness exercises. So if you notice that video games are having more of a negative impact on you in some way, it doesn't mean that you have to give up video games. You just want to make sure that you reevaluate why these negatives are happening and where are they stemming from. Once you've done that, you can figure out how to properly address key unresolved conflicts in your life. Think about the person who was or maybe still is being cyberbullied. Playing a game that allows for interactions with others online would be a risk factor because there is the potential for people to say mean things and project their own issues. This can cause another player to become triggered, and as a result, if they haven't addressed this unresolved conflict in their life and learning how to cope with it, they're more likely to feel the stress of this, which can lead to a person acting out. A suggestion for this could be to play a different genre or a game without those features so you can avoid that stress. This can be done temporarily so that you can still play enjoyable games while addressing the outside problems. Perhaps when you get to a better place in managing how you respond and cope, you can resume by playing that game because the impact will have been reduced. The coping is enhanced, and thus the overall risk is lower. So again, these are just some examples of things to look for. I really could go on forever with these examples. I mean, there really is just so many possibilities between the genres, and not even just the genres, but the gaming content, the internal and external aspects of someone's life. And, again, are there more positives than negatives or vice versa? Because you need to consider, again, even if there are more positives than negatives, how heavy are these negatives? How heavy is that impact? Because you could have maybe 20 positives that you identify and you think, wow, this is a good thing, I'm not going to stop. But on the other hand, you could have 2 negatives, and what if those negatives correlate to some serious trauma that you experienced in your past? That's not going to be healthy for you in the long run. So you really have to weigh those impacts. It's more than just how many you're counting. You have to really figure out how intense is it? What's the severity of it? And not only that, but when you do get triggered, think about the duration as well. Because if you play a game where you get frustrated, you might initially be like, oh, dang, I lost again. And then within a few minutes, you're over it. Whereas for some people, if that's lasting a long time, more than it should be, that's a red flag. So again, just to give a little bit of perspective there. So yeah, it can get complex real quick. So again, this is just meant to give you a little more insight about what to look for, and that way, if need be, you can seek proper counseling to address any areas of concern. So one last thing to consider is if you have a child that is gaming, you don't want to confront your child and come at them in an aggressive manner and say all these things about what you're seeing and that it's harmful and they shouldn't be spending this much time, they should be going outside more, whatever. You want to be careful because, again, what if your child is going to school and they're getting bullied and the whole day they're just anticipating going home because they know that when they go home, at least they can do something enjoyable and it allows them to calm down a little bit before going to do their homework maybe. If your child is struggling also to open up, if they come home and now you see them go right to the video games, your first impression might be, oh, this person's lazy and they don't want to do their homework. They don't want to interact with me. They don't want to interact with anybody. But you don't want to make assumptions like that because, again, you don't know fully what's going on until you explore that. And you have to be very delicate with how you explore that because, again, with kids especially, they don't fully understand some of the things they might be experiencing emotionally, feelings that they're experiencing. It's hard, to have that more complex understanding that an adult might have. So just keep that in mind because if you approach a child like that in an aggressive manner and take away their consoles and tell them to go do their homework, you're now adding to their frustration when maybe they just need that temporary break to kind of come down from the day, and then they might be more productive with their homework. So you really want to just take a step back and try to analyze it and really allow for your child to open up. Give them that opportunity first before you make assumptions. So I want to thank you for joining me and my webinar today. Also stay tuned for Digital Dependency Part 2, which I will be doing on social media. So again, we all are using our electronics these days, so I know it's another popular topic. But we also have a lot of other available webinars, so you can check that out at www.firstlightpsych.com. And thank you again. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me in the box to the side, or you can send me a message on my email. And thank you again.